Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for signing up to and joining us for this webinar today. We really appreciate your participation. I think it's fair to say that it's an exciting time, that we're at a tipping point when thinking about the move to renewable energy and the clean energy transition, and particularly thinking about what this means for battery electric vehicles. On the one hand, we have an increasing sense of expectation, be it from critical stakeholders or legislators. And on the other hand, we have technology as an enabler, as something that can help overcome complexity and deal with some of these global issues and challenges that we're facing. So I think the excitement of the topic that we're dealing with today is mirrored in the fact that we had a huge interest in this webinar with registrations from around 100 organizations. So we're very happy for those of you that can join us live for this webinar today. We have an exciting webinar agenda in store for all of you, and as well as expert inputs from my experienced RCS colleagues, Katie Redmond and Harrison Mitchell. I am very glad that we are joined by experts from Ford Motor Company and BHP, representing both ends of the battery value chain, and they will be talking from their perspective of a global automotive manufacturer and one of the largest mining companies and raw material producers in the world, respectively. These perspectives will be complemented by an address from Torsten Freund, who is joining us from the Global Battery Alliance, a multi-stakeholder global organization aligning the industry with other stakeholder requirements and seeking to create a battery passport for responsible batteries. Before we begin, I would just like to mention that one of our speakers from CATL, Dennis Pan, unfortunately had to cancel his speaking slot rather last minute for logistical reasons. However, he has asked me to extend his apologies to the audience, and I know that he and the team at CATL are continuing to be active participants, driving a lot of activities in the ESG space, and hopefully we can find another opportunity to hear from him soon in 2022. So I'd just like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Iain Fraser. I'm the Digital Solutions Lead at RCS Global, and I'll be chairing this webinar and at a later point providing some insights into the exciting digital developments at RCS Global. However, I would now like to kick off the webinar by handing over to Harrison Mitchell, Founder and Chief Strategy Officer of RCS Global, to reflect on recent developments in the market and the world of ESG. And we look forward to profiting from Harrison's experience as a thought leader in this space. So I think he's very well placed to provide us an analysis of the current state of affairs and perhaps what developments we can expect in 22. So please take it away, Harrison.
Thanks very much, Iain, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you on here today. I just want to extend my own thanks to the great speakers we have today. I think to have the representatives from leading firms in both the upstream and downstream really speaks to how core sustainability is to raw material sourcing, especially in EV supply chains. So I've been asked to provide a summary of trends that we see in our industry based on what we see ourselves in the market, and of course the requests and concerns of our clients, and who I think are quite representative, frankly, of the EV value chain as a whole. And as you can see, I think we are at a very interesting time for our industry, right, which is itself in very rapid growth. That is dealing with a proliferation of standards from both government and industry that are compelling a very broad adoption of ESG performance standards beyond typical industry leaders. And I think this compliance overlay, underneath this compliance overlay, we see from really across the sector, from both upstream and downstream, a real genuine desire to directly address critical issues where they have been identified, and ultimately to have positive impact. And I think where that is in effective communities, for example, to have that impact more directly. And I think that's leading to a lot of creativity in the sector as companies and industries indeed try out new initiatives. and solutions, but it's also leading to a proliferation of standards and initiatives that can and is creating some confusion in the market on the best way to respond. And indeed, some of the questions we receive, especially recently, are just simply about which approach should we take in this market at the moment. And I think that speaks to that particular issue. Look, certainly on our side, it is our assertion that the complexity of supply chains and the demand for transparency and a kind of general lack of tolerance for critical ESG issues will see a consensus emerge in the coming years to support high-performing standards and solutions that provide high-quality data assurance and transparency to enable companies to make some decisions that will affect positive change. So I think we're going to see this kind of quality movement over time. And from our side at RCS, it's certainly a reason why we've invested a lot of time and resources into developing Vine, which we'll hear about later, which is designed to be a comprehensive solution to support the ESG ambitions of the EV space, which include the battery passport, which Torsten will point to. Right, so in terms of 5 trends, I wanted to highlight 5 key areas that we see coming. Many of these will be familiar to you, but I think it's worth going over them to kind of frame the conversation that we have. The first one obviously is in greenhouse gas emissions and LCA being a major focus in scope 3, i.e. of your supply chain. And I think the interesting thing there that we're seeing is that some companies are putting emission calculations as part of their internal procurement or external procurement calculations, placing a dollar figure per ton of the CO2 emission on their own balance sheet, for example, in order to calculate the cost of greenhouse gas emissions on their supply chain. And that, of course, is going to, if you start to price that into your own balance sheet, you're obviously going to start to try and reduce that cost. And that's something that we're seeing happen. We're seeing also a move away from offsets as a mechanism to more focus on efficiencies and reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, that leads to this logical conclusion that there needs to be better data, more accurate data that is based on specific information from suppliers that can drive those improvements. So this kind of general database information that the industry's been using to date, we see a move away from that to get very specific information to drive these kind of moves towards efficiencies and reductions. A second point, that big trend that we see, and this has really come through this year in a big way in many of our clients and work that you'll see Katie talk about today, is around multi-material and comprehensive risk focus. So, if you asked me a couple of years ago what the focus was, it was cobalt, cobalt, cobalt. Now, very much so, the OEMs and battery makers are starting to incorporate a review of all the materials in the batteries, not just cobalt. Some public commitments have been made by many companies to look at more than 20 raw materials, for example. And the scope is broadening as well. So it's not just around critical human rights issues that, again, would have been the case a couple of years ago. It's really incorporating a broader range of issues: environmental impacts, working conditions, local Indigenous community consultation as well. And that's a trend that I think we'll see continue over time. Of course, the regulations and standards themselves are part of the reason, as I mentioned, that why this is happening. In particular, it will come from no surprise that the EU is really defining some of those activities in regulation. Those regulations are coming quicker, covering more geographies and companies, and requiring very concrete actions. And so, that's only going to continue in the near future. As a concrete example, the German due diligence law that came out does have a broadening away that includes both of scope, that includes both human rights and environmental impact. And as I mentioned, this proliferation of standards that are trying to respond to this regulation or become more comprehensive has led to, there is a lot of confusion in the market. There's confusion from the upstream side as to which a standard should be adopted. and confusion on the downstream side of which standard is appropriate to measure ESG performance. And I think what we'll see in the next year is a consolidation of those standards. Consolidation or death, shall we say, because I think there is a need to combine some of the standards that are out there, or at least have cross-recognition. As a fourth point, I will just move on to say, to talk about stakeholder participation. Obviously, you know, NGOs have this year raised issues primarily around, or a broad range of issues, but that include issues around working conditions, for example, around deep sea mining, environmental impact, and water use. To be fair to the NGOs, they've been raising these issues for many years, but I think the audience that we have at the moment with in the EV supply chain is such that they're starting to get the recognition that these issues deserve. So those issues are certainly going to become a part of the narrative and discussion over the next few years. Combined with that, we're seeing investors come to the table in a different way this year. So, you know, they are demanding from companies more specific and concrete information. They are demanding good data, and they are doing their own investigations as well for their first time. And I think that's an interesting trend that we've seen. Previously, investors have really been, you know, at arm's length, shall we say, and been happy with some disclosures that have been made. But now, given the risks that are in some of these supply chains, they're really starting to try and understand them at a more profound level. And I think as well, especially borne by the London Metal Exchange responsible sourcing program that is coming to bear pretty soon. A lot of the mining companies as well are starting to look at this a lot more closely and refresh their thoughts around sustainability performance. And I look forward to hearing from Andrew later in the call. And finally, the final trend that will obviously grow around the technology-backed solutions coming of age. And again, it's really our assertion, given our understanding of supply chains, that the scope of the complexity of the supply chain, the scope of the data requirements really does require tech-based solutions. And I think, you know, we're seeing rapid development of these solutions, including our own one, Vine, which you'll see later this presentation. But also within companies that are starting to invest internally to manage that data flow, manage the due diligence that they're required to do. And the battery passport as well, I think, is a very exciting idea. We'll hear from Torsten from the Global Battery Alliance on this later in the call. But I think it's within reach. And that's an exciting project for our industry. And one which I think will gain a lot of traction in the coming year, and certainly one which we will seek to support as RCS Global. So with that, hopefully that's helpful to frame the conversation, and I'll hand over to you, Iain, to take it forward. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much for that, Harrison. Yeah, indeed, a lot of developments on different fronts, and I think really indicative of how much is going on in this space. So I'd like to hand over to Kerri Redmond, Mapping and Auditing Program Project Director, to talk about major trends that we see in coming out of our due diligence, mapping and auditing activities. Thanks very much, Kerri.
Hi, thanks, Iain. Hello, everyone. My name is Kerri Redmond, and I'm a project director at RCS within our Mapping and Audits unit. For those not familiar, RCS Global runs the most widely used audit and mapping program in the battery industry. We assist downstream customers to identify some key questions. For example, primarily, what is my battery supply chain for key raw materials? So who are the actors? What's the size and scale of it? And how can we untangle and understand the complexity of the supply chains? Secondly, what ESG risks are present, and what are the due diligence practices of the actors in my supply chain? And how can we mitigate those risks? So we run a sequential audit mapping program where we audit every tier of the supply chain for identified raw materials to generate validated audit data of supply chain performance against responsible sourcing and ESG criteria. So these programs allow customers to draw clear, validated lines from mine to market to understand raw material flow, understand risk exposure, and provide evidence to stakeholders that they are undergoing due diligence activities. So as a result of increasing demand for supply chain transparency and introduction of supply chain regulations, as mentioned by Harrison, we're seeing a huge increase in demand for these types of programs. In the past few years, we've seen a twofold increase in supplier mapping programs commissioned by brand companies. So this is a significant indicator of the value this type of data generating audit program brings, especially when we also look at the material scope expansion. For a space that was once dominated by cobalt and a few nickel audits, we now see regular demand for multi-material audit programs. Cobalt, lithium, nickel, graphite, manganese, copper, and other battery materials now comprise a larger share of the overall audits we conduct on an annual basis. In 2019, less than 1% of the battery supply chain audits we conducted were for these materials. Now it's close to 50%. So of course, as Harrison pointed out, the demand is not just reflected in a wider spectrum of materials, but also in the request to audit for ESG risk categories at all tier levels, such as environment, working conditions, community impact, business ethics, etc. Given the trends Harrison spoke about and looking ahead to 2022, we do expect the demand for auditing and mapping programs to continue to increase, with expanded scopes to cover these very critical risk areas and continue to bring real-time validated data to our customers so they can demonstrate good ESG practice and continue reinforcing adoption of due diligence practices within their own supply chains. Next slide, please. So of course, more demand naturally leads to more volume. Since 2019, not only have we seen an increase in the number of customers and of the scope, but also this is of course correlated with increase in the total number of battery supply chain audits we're conducting each year and expanded our geographic reach. Since 2019, we've seen a 57% increase in the total number of audits we conduct globally, with a significant increase in the number of audits being conducted outside of China, owing to the added demand for non-cobalt materials with unique supply chains. So we're annually conducting audits across 6 continents, and we expect this is our new normal. So it's no surprise that more demand and more volume can lead to greater positive impact, as mentioned by Harrison as well. As we conduct more and more audits, we also note a strong growth in the number of new auditees, that is, suppliers who have never undergone a responsible sourcing audit. So not only are we conducting annual re-audits of a large portion of the supply chain, but we're also adding to the list of suppliers who are exposed to the concept of responsible sourcing, who are being asked to demonstrate their own ESG and due diligence efforts, and who are then entering into an engagement process with their downstream customers to close corrective actions and demonstrate continual improvement. Further, we've seen suppliers who have undergone audits in consecutive years against the same criteria have shown overall improved performance against the OECD 5-step framework, which is the basis for our audit program and also the reference standard for almost all responsible sourcing standards and frameworks used in the industry today. So therefore, the demand for the audits and the volume that's required to meet that demand is helping to embed due diligence practices and encourage continued improvement for actors all along the supply chain. Next slide, please. So this is to say we believe this trend will continue. As more regulations are introduced, as the demand for transparency and good practice becomes more mainstreamed, the more demand there will be for mapping and audit programs like the ones we run at RCS Global to validate audit data within raw material supply chains. So it also naturally means there's an immense amount of ongoing dynamic data generated, which customers and their stakeholders need to be able to digest and understand in a meaningful way. So to that point, I'd like to turn back to my colleague Iain, who will explain how the data generated from these processes can be better utilized to visualize, assess, and manage supply chains and drive improvement in the ESG space. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Katie. And now I will just change my hats from the role of moderator to presenter for a short segment. So in this segment, I'd like to talk about RCS Global's response from a digital solutions perspective to the developments that Harrison outlined at a kind of broader level, and specifically at that large amount of data that's been coming out of the mapping and auditing services that we've been delivering over the last years that Katie presented. So I will introduce the kind of development that at RCS Global side, how we got to our beta version of our digital solution Vine, and I will talk about upcoming developments. Then I will switch and take over the screen sharing for a moment to provide a sneak preview of the platform and its beta version. And then I will continue by providing a few more general insights into digitalization of ESG and due diligence in battery supply chains. So where have we come from? Well, as Katie mentioned and Harrison in the segment previously, the challenge that a lot of companies face when looking at due diligence and ESG in multi-tier supply chains is complexity of these supply chains and the increasing need and indeed requirement for providing supply chain transparency. So RCS began with a minimal viable product. So we developed a supply chain visualization tool, the Freund platform that I will be presenting shortly, and started with this MVP. This was to support clients to understand their supply chains, as Katie said, who's in it, but also to look at the OECD conformance and performance in those supply chains. We built out the tool to support clients to kind of understand the supplier performance, which means that we had supplier scorecards that demonstrated the relative performance of the suppliers at each stage. And the entire platform was basically fed with validated data, which allowed our clients to be sure that this was an accurate depiction of their supply chain, and then to focus on corrective action plan and red flags, etc., to enable sustainable supply chain managers to have a better overview of their mapping and audit programs, and as well as their suppliers and sub-suppliers' performance. So moving on to the current status, as mentioned in beta version, we are currently testing the capabilities and the potential for ongoing feature developments with business partners and established clients. In this regard, we're building out multi-material filtering. As Harrison mentioned in the trends, we see that a lot of companies are no longer just wanting to focus on one materials, but rather want to overlay their various supply chains and understand how these interrelate. And also that they want to compare audit performance, or rather supplier performance, as measured by audits over time. Finally, another ongoing development at the moment is more proactive corrective action plan management. So it's one thing to just conduct audits of your supply chain, but it's another one, how do you enable supply chain managers to really follow up with suppliers and sub-suppliers in terms of their corrective action plans that come out of such audit and due diligence programs. And finally, looking ahead to 2022, we are on a good course for Vine 1.0, which will be our public launch. As you can see, we're already thinking ahead to Vine 2.0. We want to add high accuracy LCA estimates and potentially audited LCA data to round out the traditionally and historically strong OECD and human rights due diligence data that we've been providing. We want to enable roll up so that you can aggregate the scores across and throughout a supply chain, which would then allow you to come up with an aggregated scoring for different supply lines. And we're looking at the possibility of opening up our verified supplier database system to incorporate, for example, other public or third-party ESG data and enable clients to map their own supply chains, as well as many more features. So we're very excited to be a part of the conversation and around alignment of the need for a battery passport and potential developments for that. I'm very much looking forward to Torsten's presentation after this one. So we think that verified and accurate ESG data is absolutely core and key to demonstrating performance in these complex supply chains, and also to improve this, to kind of to prove the story of continual improvement, which we think is the only way to then increase the responsibility in EV battery supply chains. So I would now like to just provide a brief sneak preview of Vine. So if someone could please give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen, or an indication.
We can, thanks. Iain.
Great. So I would just like to preface this demonstration with a little caveat. This is a realistic supply chain based on an actual audit program that we have conducted. However, this is anonymized data that you're looking at. So both the names, the locations, and the audit performance have been randomized. However, it is a very realistic depiction of a typical sort of audit program and due diligence program that has been conducted on a specific supply chain. So without further ado, I'd like to take you through our supply chain mapping functionality. Typically, and as Katie mentioned, we progress with a kind of cascaded audit approach, beginning in the downstream to look at final inputs, for example, for a BEV, for a battery electric battery module, and then go back up the supply chain to understand and validate all of the inputs that end up in that battery. So normally behind a battery supplier, you have the cathode and anode manufacturers. They then take their supplies from fine refiners, who themselves can either source from crude refiners or treatment units or other refiners and traders. And then moving back up the supply chain, you start getting to the mining level, which can include large-scale mines and artisanal mines. Now, as you can see, this is just one example of a kind of supply chain ecosystem, and already it's getting quite full. And I can say from personal experience that some supply chain maps are significantly more complex. Now, what we see here on the tool is a color coding of supplier performance. So if we want to look at this cathode manufacturer, for example, we can open up the supplier scorecard and see how this supplier has performed, for example, against OECD, but also maybe other areas have been addressed, such as health and safety, human rights, or looking at ISO certifications. We can see when the audit was conducted and when the audit should be rescheduled. We can also see if the corrective action plan that has come out of that audit, what the status of that is. As mentioned, we want to work on building out features of kind of time travel of supplier and sub-supplier performance, which would enable users to compare audit data over time. But taking it back to our first supplier, you can see here that on the tool, we have an indication of a kind of red thread. So many companies define critical high risks that they want to understand if these are occurring in their supply chains. And this tool, you can dive down into individual supply lines to really trace back to the source. And as you can see, in this case, we have 2 artisanal mines, which might have been considered a kind of critical risk for this battery producer. And therefore, you are able to drill down and understand the source of the material that's entering into the final product. Furthermore, we're looking at building out different filters that allow supply chain managers with one clear overview to see what the status is in terms of correct action plans, which have been audited, as well as the performance. And as mentioned, we look to build out an LCA, lifecycle assessment functionality that would allow a similar depiction for environmental performance of the different suppliers and sub-suppliers in the future. For those a little bit less visually focused and more analytical, we also have an analysis tabular view in which you can indicate different supplier types, look at their respective audit scores, maybe determine who has not yet received an audit and conduct analysis on this. So yeah, we're very excited about the journey that Vine has taken. As mentioned previously, this is the product of years of conducting mapping and auditing activities in this space. And we are very excited about the beta release and testing that is ongoing, and very much looking forward to our public release of Vine 1.0 shortly. So with that, I'll stop the sneak preview. And if you could please return to the presentation. Thanks very much. So given time constraints, I will just try be uncharacteristically brief here. Basically, when thinking about digitizing due diligence and how to conduct data-led responsible sourcing, we see that validated data is basically at the core of all of these activities. You know, garbage in, garbage out is an old adage, but still very much a true one. Now, when thinking about digitizing and due diligence activities in general, we see that the first step really needs to be obtaining transparency. This really is required and is an increasing requirement we see from stakeholders, not only critical, maybe civil society and NGO stakeholders, but increasingly investors, large fleet customers, as well as municipalities and public authorities. Now, if you can digitize your supply chain and really create that transparency, showing your transparency efforts over time, then using these solutions, you are able to report much more accurately and dependably to your various stakeholders, showing your mapping activities. As we've said in the previous sections, these raw material supply chains are extremely complex. And therefore, when you begin with transparency undertakings, you tend to uncover more complexity. Therefore, it's important to measure the performance and report on this in a continuous manner. And we think that digital solutions such as Vine that can encompass entire supply chain ecosystems make this much more manageable for companies and organizations at various stages in the supply chain. Credible due diligence has moved from being a nice to have to a must have, and reliable supply chain data underlies any attempt to make credible claims about what's happening in the supply chain. So as Katie has described, you know, we conduct serious auditing and mapping programs all around the electric vehicle battery space, and we use this data to help our clients make risk management decisions and to prioritize their efforts and activities. This then allows them in turn to be able to demonstrate progress. So if you're measuring the performance of your suppliers and sub-suppliers in the supplier ecosystem, you're able to show that at different times through engagement and through your due diligence program, that their performance is in improving over time. We think that the integration of technology to support transparency and due diligence and the positive effects it has on reporting will grow. So linking ESG data from mine sites all the way through to downstream end users. We believe that this will become the norm and will open up new opportunities for leading players to demonstrate, you know, their positive performance and to tell the right stories and realistic and believable stories. And then once this has been achieved, the next logical step is to scale this within and across ecosystems, which will require solutions being able to communicate with one another. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of Torsten's thought on this topic. And digital product IDs also depend on validated and verified data. The battery passport and similar technological solutions, we think, will become the norm, not just for our industry. However, the perceived legitimacy will depend on the verification, broad stakeholder engagement and involvement in those standards. And yeah, we are confident that with validated data such as that we are providing and hope to provide through Vine, that we can then point to real improvement and use this data to actually have a positive impact. So with that, I come to the end of my section, and I now put back on my moderator hat, and I would like to hand over to Dr. Torsten Freund from the Global Battery Alliance. Please take it away, Torsten.
Thank you very much, Iain. So it's my pleasure to speak with you today about our ideas on the battery passport from the perspective of the Global Battery Alliance. So let me share my screen with you and guide you through our thoughts based on a couple of slides which we have created, highlighting our ideas. So can you let me know whether you can see the presentation in the full screen mode, that everybody is able to look at it?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, fantastic. So let's jump into the presentation. So Global Battery Alliance was formed under the World Economic Forum in 2017 and has given itself the mission to strive for a completely circular economy as a driver for sustainability, as well as for a lower carbon economy to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And the Alliance looks at pretty much all aspects around batteries, how they enable a transition from a fossil fuel driven lifestyle of mankind to a renewable energy driven lifestyle of mankind. That goes very much along with batteries and the recovery of battery materials to drive circularity. That goes along with an industry transition, which will create jobs, economic value, and in the end will be a responsible approach to ensuring transparency of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as other sustainability parameters. And with that said, you have already lined out in your presentation, Iain and Harrison, that there is much more than just greenhouse gas. Therefore, we are looking at the entire scope of safeguarding human rights and economic development in line with the UN sustainability goals. So what is it about what makes GBA special? This initiative has formed from an industry perspective that we wanted to create a level playing field for all actors who really commit to the objectives of a sustainable build-up of the supply chain. In order to do so, there are many more stakeholders from civil society, from governments, thought leaders, and all those are finding their home on the platform of GBA, being agnostic to the participants and providing a pre-competitive platform for a protected information exchange and thought leadership. One of the key elements of achieving those objectives is to provide insight and knowledge based on transparency, to know what's going on in the ESG space, having then the capability of benchmarking individual performances once against the other, really to have an evaluation scheme and be able to set ideas, what's a good performer, what's a not so good performer, and where is the progress coming from. And monitoring progress over time will be the key to see whether the measures you have envisioned in this whole space are really providing the pace towards a circular and responsible economy. How does that look like for the battery passport? We envision that the individual actors along the value chain, be it industry players involved in the manufacturing or consumers or governments, each will have their individual screens of getting the required information to do their job better. But this information will be based on data. Data for being meaningful, as Iain, you said it, garbage in, garbage out is no option here. Therefore, data must be standardized, that we are talking about the same thing. Data must be accurate, that you're really having a clear measure and not too much variability and ambiguity. Those data must be differentiating, that you can distinguish between the good and the bad in the performance. It must be auditable in the way that you have a third party assuring what the individual's report is accurate. And it must be comprehensive, covering all relevant aspects of the value chain. In order to achieve this objective, we're pretty much in line with what you have presented, to follow the physical structure of a battery, dismantling the battery into the individual components and tracing the components back to the origin, so basically to their cradle. And for each of these components, special indicators will be relevant. Those will cover the area of sustainability in the terms of environmental, societal, governance, and economic field. We have identified about 30 issues which will be relevant in the ESG space, but to build a prototype for a battery passport, we are focusing on only 2 to not overcomplicate the issue and to focus on the most relevant ones, which is in the environmental space, greenhouse gas footprint, and in the societal space, we decided for child labor being one of the most relevant parameters. The job now is that we need to negotiate who needs to see which part of the data in order to do his or her job, and which data need to be protected for confidential reasons and for respecting the IP of business owners. So how can we do that? So the first thing what we need is to connect the physical world of a battery with the digital world. Therefore, we are collaborating with the institution GS1 in Europe, who are the mothers and fathers of the barcode, and have developed metrics for defining by a QR code an individual number for each battery that can host as a container for further data. These data will be labeling a battery, so describing the battery as a physical object, to have the data about the chemistry, which is most relevant in the end, at the end of the life cycle, when it comes to recycling, or performance data, what's the electrical energy stored in the battery, what's the best use of the battery. Well, being aware that we are focusing very much on electric vehicles for the time being. However, the scope is very broad and can encompass every kind of battery you may imagine. So just to cover once again, the space of data we are looking for, greenhouse gas is of course the first one. However, in the environmental field, there will be further coming to be individually developed in projects, child labor in the social area, many others are coming. So is in the governance space and for putting some economic parameters to the table as well, seeing how the whole area can develop. So now it's the time to look at a moment how the material world and the digital world can be interconnected. So in the upstream supply chain, from the raw materials which are innocent in the earth for 150 million years, that's the 0 point. But as soon as you start digging out minerals, you start having an impact on environment and on social parameters, such as energy required for digging out minerals, or in the refining space, heating the rocks to extract the metals. With this material flow, the parameters to be measured in the environmental space build up until the cell production, until we now start to have a physical unit. And only if a battery exists at the first time when the pack is being produced, then we can attach the digital number and the label to the battery and attach into this container all the upstream information about the prevalence of materials, which is feeding very much into what Iain has presented with the vine. Then the battery goes into life, is driving in a car, and will generate further data on the operational time. And in the end, this information will make it possible to distinguish whether a second life in stationary applications, for example, is possible for the battery taken out of a car, or the materials will be recovered for using them again in the material cycle to produce new batteries. So looking at the whole cycle from raw materials through the life and the recycling, many companies are involved, and the companies with their individual products converge at one single point at the battery OEM. In order to do now the reporting, we need to create appropriate standards so that we are talking about the same things if we are reporting data. The second piece will be collecting data and entering into the battery passport. And then the next step comes on top to do something with the data, not only having data, but really to evaluate the data, to derive knowledge from it, to analyze the data and take action and monitor whether the effectiveness of the action in our platform. So step one, we're creating guidelines now for the greenhouse gas footprint together with the team, that we are interpreting existing standards to the way that we have accurate data by interpretation within the limits of provided standards such as ISO or PEF or you name them. The second piece on the child labor is there are as well around 30 applicable standards in the value chain, and making those interoperable that they can report on the reported parameters can be compared is our purpose of a work group dealing with child labor. So in the end, the companies will be enabled to present a set of data relevant for ESG performance on their fence. Throughout the value chain, these data now need to travel somehow to the battery producer, and that will be done by traceability tools. And there is not only one, there will be several of them. Therefore, these data can be collected through several traceability tools, complemented with manufacturer data at the OEM level, and then all that is going together to become a battery passport, which is then stored and maintained over the use phase. The key word here is it must be interoperable. These many players, these many tools must work together. And in two aspects. Number one is to specify the content to be interoperable. And number two is to specify the interaction of the technological platforms that they can interoperate. This is now the purpose of GBA's work. We built a platform bringing all those stakeholders together to agree on these common standards. That in the end, we will be able to monitor data throughout the entire life cycle and ensure closing the loop for batteries in this space. The whole value chain will then provide the data, and in order to do the piece of the job of benchmarking, GBA intends to build in the later stage the assurance platform that is interacting with the value chain data and to provide the output for governments, for NGOs, include the auditors, and inform clients and customers about the sustainability performance of their batteries, and thereby providing not only data rather than knowledge how to improve in this space. So in a nutshell, the battery passport is a key enabling tool providing data-based ESG transparency. We as GBA believe that this understanding from clear data will drive a change towards a sustainable and responsible supply chain in battery. And GBA is here the platform to convene all those stakeholders which really can make the difference and work together in a safe and pre-competitive environment. So there's a lot of challenges ahead of us. And what should us prevent rolling up the sleeves and really making this sustainable future happen? So let's work together and start this right now and today. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Torsten. That was impressive how much information could be presented in an compact manner, but I think these are really exciting developments, and I'm looking forward to the question and answers part at the end of the webinar. So with that, I would like to hand over to Kerri Abbott from Ford Motor Companies to talk about these topics from your perspective. Take it away, Kerri.
Well, thanks for having me. I will try to condense my presentation given the time frame right now, but thanks for having me today. So as part of Ford's human rights aspirations, we do aspire to source only raw materials that are responsibly produced. And many of the raw materials that end up in our products are not currently directly sourced by us, as with most OEMs. So we do rely heavily on our suppliers to ensure that our materials are responsibly sourced. With over 1,200 production suppliers at around 40,000 parts per car, this gets to be very complicated very quickly, particularly when you trace it through the material level. So identifying sources of materials down to the point of origin, such as mine, farm, or forest, can get very complicated quickly. Once sources are identified, then as I think Katie mentioned, the next challenge is really understanding their ESG performance, identifying the gaps within that performance, and then managing improvements. So we do find that this process is easier, obviously, with our directly contracted suppliers at the tier 1 and tier 2 levels. But as we've gone through this process, we find it more difficult for our sub-suppliers with whom we may not hold direct contracts. And we have also found that there's a reluctance to be transparent about the sources, really primarily beyond the choke point of these supply chains. And we find that this impedes transparency and improvements throughout the raw material supply chain. To help manage the complexities and the requirements that are within our raw material supply chain network, we obviously rely on data, and we must continue to rely on data-driven solutions such as supply chain mapping, and we're also investigating blockchain to help track the dynamic material supply chains, not just from the point of origin, but also understanding their ESG performance, and then also how they're improving. Collecting the data on our supply chain allows Ford and our tier 1 suppliers to track, but also demonstrate continuous improvement in ESG throughout the automotive material supply chain and broader industry, really. The data allows, most importantly, it really allows us to help prioritize suppliers who may need the most support. So your efforts are where they're supposed to be as an OEM. Eventually, as suppliers improve, we believe that this will be add to allowing suppliers to be more comfortable with being transparent, particularly in the ESG realm, and then also start to disclose the sources of their material and their ESG performance. Transparency about the origin of material, we believe, is critical to improving more holistically the conditions of raw material extraction. Data collected through supplier audits also helps each company specifically tell a story and demonstrate improvements through the corrective action plans that the audits generate. When audited system improvements can be implemented based on the audit results, suppliers can use this data again to strengthen beyond just due diligence, but and not just for Ford, but for our industry and then also other ESG areas. It's critical that to Ford that there are standardized processes to collect and analyze data. For example, Ford currently uses the Responsible Minerals Initiative RMI Risk Readiness Assessment to help evaluate mine ESG performance. It does provide a uniform framework for assessment criteria. And I'm not sure if anybody saw in automotive news yesterday, there was actually a data-driven article, and Ford was quoted stating that, we do believe that by collaborating with other leading industries in this network, it is our intent to use state-of-the-art technology to ensure that the materials produced for our vehicles will help meet our commitment to protecting human rights and the environment. So again, really the data helps drive our aspirational goals as well. In 2021, Ford did begin to map and audit our EV battery material supply chain, and we have approved the use of Vine to help track the complex EV battery material supply chain in its beta version. So the Vine, what we have found, has allowed us to obtain a better overall picture of our material sources, and again, their current performance, as Iain showed you, to not just responsible sourcing, but we've also been able to implement ESG audits as well. We did choose Vine currently because we don't have a tool right now to map or visualize or consolidate material supply chains. And because I sit in supply chain sustainability, but our EV battery material supply chain has to consider and better understand the material supply chain at this point in time. It's allowed us to have a collaborative tool internally as well in a very simplified format. I do believe Vine has been a great complement to the auditing and mapping project and helping organize complex data that's easily accessible. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Iain. I think the next up to speak is BHP.
Thanks very much for that, Kerri. And just to clear up, we have the call booked until past. So for those that don't have to drop off at the hour, I would very much encourage you to hear last, but by no means least, Andrew Jacobs' interesting input. Please take it away, Andrew.
Well, thanks, Iain. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about some of the actions that we're taking as a company in responsible and sustainable production, as well as share some really important themes that we see in the responsible spend landscape. For those that may be a little bit less familiar with BHP, we've been producing resources for over 130 years, and sustainability sits at the top of our company's charter values. We produce commodities essential to everyday life, economic growth, and decarbonisation: copper for renewable energy, nickel for electric vehicles, iron ore and high quality metallurgical coal for global infrastructure and the energy transition, and in the future, potash for sustainable farming. So to give you a little bit of context on our value chain, we have operated assets and offices in 19 countries, with our main production though in Australia, Chile, and North America. Upstream, we have roughly 9,000 direct suppliers in over 61 countries. 85% of them sit in 3 countries, Australia, Chile, and the US. And downstream, our customers are well diversified by geography and sector. So we sit at the start of the minerals value chain and also at the end of it as a large consumer of final products such as vehicles for our operations. So in terms of responsible and sustainable production, we've taken a risk-based and collaborative approach to managing ethical and environmental risks in our value chain for a while now. I'd like to share just a few examples of the work from across the teams in BHP that are more relevant to the metals and battery supply chain. So in responsible production, we were recently awarded the Copper Mark for our copper operations at Escondida and Spence in Chile and Olympic Dam in South Australia. This was for us about aligning with better practice and assurance-based responsible production across critical areas, including the environment, community, human rights, and governance. We know that long-term sustainability credentials are important to our customers and increasingly for end consumers. And the work from the teams on Copper Mark also contributes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For responsible mining standards for our broader business, which also includes nickel, we're working rigorously on this, and we expect to be able to communicate more on our approach in the new year. On responsible sourcing, which relates to our inbound supply chain, we have an ethical supply chain and transparency program where we have clear expectations for that inbound supply chain. So for suppliers which register as higher risk, we do enhanced due diligence, which can include independent assurance audits and supporting them through development plans. We also know that our supply chain and the associated risks will continue to evolve, and we're currently incorporating OECD aligned due diligence for our metal supply chain, as well as obviously also as a part of compliance with the LME's responsible sourcing standard. Of course, we also undertake ethical due diligence on our own business. And following a recent pilot project, we now have a globally consistent methodology for conducting human rights impact assessments across our operated assets. On the environmental transparency side, we've been working at this for a long time. We actually started disclosing our greenhouse gas emissions performance from as early as 1998, and we were one of the first companies to report in accordance with the TCFD. But if we fast forward to today, we recently completed a carbon neutral copper transaction leveraging blockchain technology. And while we don't intend carbon neutral to imply certification under any standard or application of a particular methodology, we collaborated in the pilot to improve the understanding of emissions in the copper value chain, as well as demonstrate the role that high quality offsets can play while in this transitional period of decarbonising our operations. And on nickel, where we produce some of the lowest carbon intensity nickel in the world, we have a collaboration with a major EV producer to, amongst other important social value initiatives, mature end-to-end raw material traceability in the battery supply chain. I would also add, though, the voluntary social investment side to transparency, which at times can be overlooked as it can be perceived as a bit harder to measure. Again, on the theme of collaboration, we work in partnership with civil society, governments, and corporations to find solutions to common challenges. So, for example, the BHP Foundation, established and funded by BHP, complements our support of global transparency initiatives. So it has a natural resources governance program that is specifically focused on improving governance across the resources value chain. So we work in partnership with Transparency International to continue to contribute to the global transparency and anti-corruption agenda. And we participate in open ownership, the first public global database of open company ownership information, which is really there to fight corruption. And we encourage our suppliers and partners to do the same. Now, we also wanted to share a few themes that we're seeing in the responsible standards landscape, and particularly a key challenge that we believe we need to resolve as a value chain to deliver more meaningful impact. Now, we devote significant time today to carefully understand, integrate, and govern our compliance with a number of sustainability standards, disclosure commitments, and membership requirements. From that experience, we've come to appreciate the importance of a few things. On the organizational side, really trying to build the right accountabilities and capabilities to proactively address ESG standards over the long run. On the information side, developing a strong foundation for ESG data systems, focusing on meaningful information has been touched on multiple times in the sessions today, and leveraging the right technologies. And on the planning side, building a roadmap for responsible standards alignment, as well as advocacy that strikes the right balance between market demands, as well as other imperatives for our business and supply chain. Now, externally, we've observed growing focus and depth across the full spectrum of ESG performance criteria, with climate rightly still the high priority. To Harrison's point earlier, we've also seen a significant rise in multi-stakeholder participation in standard development, which is really healthy. We also see that specific standards needs from the market range quite significantly depending on the sector, commodity, and the geography that's involved. So, for example, the responsible standards expectations from steel supply chains can vary quite a bit from battery supply chains, and with further variations across jurisdictions, despite the minerals in instance ending up in the same final end consumer product. So we ultimately support the goal of establishing both ambitious and attainable standards that are truly inclusive and drive continuous improvement from everyone. We recognize that it's not an easy job for standards bodies also, as even with the best intentions, it can be difficult to develop standards that make sense for everyone's context. So decision-making on the form standards should take in this multi-stakeholder environment requires, in our view, an even higher level of pragmatism from all participants in the value chain. Now, this brings us to the key challenge or perhaps opportunity. That is the currently high volume and fragmented nature of responsible standards, alongside very wide-ranging expectations from stakeholders, generates a lot of complexity to interpret, integrate, and predict how standards will evolve. And that complexity is naturally elevated for global multi-commodity producers. Now, we ultimately want to embrace standards to enable the value chain to lift ESG performance. And we think we can only do that effectively if standards are inherently designed in a way that are more consistent globally across minerals, that are easy enough for everyone to understand quickly, and are focused on the ethical and environmental risks that will really move the needle. So we believe everyone in the value chain has a role to play in driving a simpler and more impactful standards landscape. It would also help keep the focus for resources on executing the critical projects that deliver positive ESG impact. And we certainly intend to play our part in working together with the multi-stakeholder community to secure greater clarity and simplicity, including where appropriate through standards, convergence, and equivalency pathways. I'm going to close there, and I hope, if nothing else, what's been shared in this short section really reinforces the importance that we place on responsible and sustainable production under a risk-based and collaborative approach, a clear intent for continuous improvement of ESG performance with an orderly transition to assurance-based models. And that simplicity in the standards landscape is really a key enabler for securing more meaningful impact for people and the planet. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much for that, Andrew. Yeah, it's important, I think, certainly speaking from my own perspective, to hear about the perspectives of organizations operating at different points in a value chain. but in some way actually all connected by the kind of challenges that are affecting us. And thanks to all the participants. It was really in terms of a broad range of registrations and signups for this webinar. It has been recorded, and we will be making this material available. A huge thanks to our panelists, and I look forward to continuing dialogue with all of you, and I'm really excited about what 2022 is bringing, and really making sure that we use this ESG data in the battery supply chain space to have real impact. So with that, I would like to say thank you all, and good evening, good morning, and good day.